On the morning of May 7th, 1965, the Great Lakes were wrapped in fog. Not ordinary fog, the kind that turns steel ships into shadows. The kind where a vessel can be less than a ship length away and still remain invisible. The kind where every sound signal seems to come from everywhere at once. The SS Cedarville was approaching the Mackinac Bridge, loaded deep with limestone and moving through the Straits of Mackinac, one of the busiest and most dangerous passages on the Great Lakes. She was not alone. Other freighters were moving through the same waterway. Some were slowing, some were sounding fog signals, some were relying almost entirely on radar. But Cedarville was still making nearly full speed. Within minutes, a foreign freighter would emerge from the fog and drive its reinforced bow into Cedarville's side. The collision did not immediately sink her. That would come later. What sealed Cedarville's fate was a chain of decisions made after the impact. Decisions about speed, damage control, beaching, and the order that never came in time. 35 men were aboard. 10 would not survive. And the sinking of the Cedarville would become one of the most devastating Great Lakes disasters of the 1960s. This is the story of the SS Cedarville. The ship that would become Cedarville did not begin life under that name. Her keel was laid down in 1926 at Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, one of the most important shipyards on the lakes. The same company would later build the Edmund Fitzgerald. She was launched on April 9, 1927, as the SS A.F. Harvey. At 603 feet long and 60 feet across the beam, she was not the largest freighter on the lakes, but she was still a powerful and respectable vessel for her time. She was built as a straight-deck bulk carrier, designed to haul immense quantities of iron ore, limestone, coal, and other bulk cargo through the Great Lakes system. Unlike later self-unloaders, straight-deck freighters depended on shore-based unloading equipment. That made them less flexible, but it also allowed them to carry more cargo. Their holds were box-shaped and efficient, built for capacity. The A.F. Harvey was powered by coal-fired Scotch boilers and a triple-expansion steam engine driving a single screw. She could make roughly 10 to 12 knots and generated about 2,200 horsepower. She began her career with the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, part of U.S. Steel's massive Great Lakes shipping operation. Her first serious incident came early. On May 18, 1928, while sailing through heavy fog near Detour Village, she collided with the whaleback steamer John Erickson. The Harvey escaped with comparatively minor damage, but the Erickson was badly damaged and had to be beached to avoid sinking. It was an eerie preview of what would happen nearly 4 decades later. For most of her early career, however, the A.F. Harvey worked without major incident. Then, in 1956, she underwent a major conversion. She was transferred into the Bradley fleet and rebuilt as a self-unloader. Her cargo holds were modified, conveyors were installed, and she was given equipment that allowed her to discharge cargo without relying on shore-based unloaders. The conversion reduced some cargo capacity, but it gave her far greater operational flexibility. She could now pull alongside a dock and unload limestone or stone directly onto shore. With the conversion came a new name. The A.F. Harvey became the SS Cedarville. Her new home port was Calcite, Michigan, near Rogers City, a limestone port that was deeply tied to the Bradley fleet. For families in Rogers City, the ships were not distant industrial machines. They were part of daily life. Fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons sailed aboard them. The community lived by the fleet, and in 1958, it nearly broke under the weight of tragedy. On November 18, 1958, the Carl D. Bradley, flagship of the Bradley fleet, broke apart and sank in Lake Michigan. 33 of her 35 crewmen were lost. 23 of the dead were from Rogers City. Overnight, 23 women became widows. 53 children lost their fathers. Many of the men who later sailed aboard Cedarville had known the Bradley crew personally. Some had served with them. Some had once sailed aboard the Bradley themselves. So when Cedarville continued working through the early 1960s, she did so under the shadow of a disaster her crew had not forgotten. In 1961, Cedarville was modernized again. During winter layup, she was reboilered with a water tube boiler, improving her performance and slightly increasing her speed. A newer, sleeker stack also changed her profile. But there were concerns. After the modernization, inspections found that portions of her hull plating forward needed attention. The repairs were expensive, and the company requested permission to defer them. The Coast Guard approved the delay, considering the issue manageable at the time. Then, in October 1964, Cedarville grounded in the St. Mary's River under Captain Martin Joppik. A bow plate was bent, and a leak developed. Repairs were made during winter layup, and the leak was considered manageable. By the spring of 1965, Cedarville was back in service. The Bradley fleet needed her. U.S. Steel wanted more product moved, more limestone, more trips, fewer delays. The season was young, but the pressure was already building. In early May, Cedarville loaded limestone at Calcite for another run through the lakes. Loading at Calcite was hard, dirty, physical work. Limestone could pile over the hatch combings, spilling across the deck, forcing deckhands to shovel it back into the holds before the vessel could properly sail. By the early morning of May 7th, Cedarville was ready. Captain Martin Joppik came aboard around 4:40 a.m. The weather was already troublesome. Warm, moist air had moved over the cold waters of Lake Huron and the Straits of Mackinac, creating a thick blanket of fog. This was not unusual for spring on the Great Lakes, but fog changes everything. It reduces visibility. It slows reaction time. It turns routine navigation into a guessing game of radar contacts, sound signals, and judgment. At 5:01 a.m., Cedarville pulled away from Calcite. She was loaded deep with limestone, drawing roughly 22 feet forward and aft. Her single propeller turned at 88 revolutions per minute, pushing the heavily loaded freighter at about 12 miles per hour. Her destination was Gary, Indiana. At roughly the same time, another vessel was moving through the Great Lakes system. The Norwegian freighter Topdalsfjord had come across the Atlantic and entered the lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway. She was a modern ocean-going vessel, 436 feet long, equipped with diesel engines capable of producing around 6,200 horsepower. She was faster and more maneuverable than Cedarville, with a reinforced bow suited for ice and North Atlantic service. Her captain, Rasmus Holland, was experienced. He had been sailing since the 1920s and had made numerous trips into the Great Lakes. By May 7th, Topdalsfjord was moving through the Straits of Mackinac in the same dense fog that surrounded Cedarville. The conditions were dangerous enough that another vessel had already struck a fixed object. The freighter J.A.W. Iglehart, often referenced in accounts of the day as the ship that struck Gray's Reef Light, collided with the lighthouse in the fog. The impact damaged the vessel, though fortunately, no one aboard the ship or lighthouse was injured. It should have been a warning. The fog was not simply inconvenient, it was hazardous. Cedarville continued toward the Mackinac Bridge. At 7:48 a.m., she altered course. At 8:12, she passed Poe Reef Light. By then, visibility had deteriorated enough that the light could not be seen visually. The crew relied on radar and radio navigation. At 8:42, Cedarville passed the Sheboygan traffic-lighted bell buoy and came further to starboard, lining up for the southern channel beneath the Mackinac Bridge. This was a high-traffic area, and Captain Joppik made security calls over the radio to announce Cedarville's position and intentions. Soon, Cedarville communicated with the southbound freighter Benson Ford. The two vessels agreed to a port-to-port passing. Cedarville adjusted course slightly to starboard. Captain Joppik later claimed he reduced speed during these maneuvers. The vessel's logs and helmsman testimony did not support that claim. Cedarville passed Benson Ford without visual contact. The ships were close, but the fog was too thick for either bridge team to see the other. Then came another radar contact. The German freighter Weissenberg was approaching after passing under the Mackinac Bridge. Her captain, Werner Otto May, contacted Cedarville and agreed to a port-to-port passing. Captain May also warned Cedarville that another vessel was ahead. That vessel was Topdalsfjord. Cedarville attempted to contact the Norwegian freighter by radio, but there was no response. To this day, why Topdalsfjord did not hear or respond to Cedarville remains uncertain. Her radio equipment was functioning, and she had heard other radio traffic that day. Topdalsfjord, meanwhile, was navigating cautiously. Captain Holland had reduced speed in the fog, sometimes nearly stopping. Lookouts were posted forward. The ship was sounding signals. Radar was in use. The fog was so thick that at times, large vessels appeared only 100 to 200 feet away. On Topdalsfjord's bridge, a radar contact appeared about 20 degrees off the starboard bow, roughly a mile and a half away, closing fast. That contact was Cedarville. Captain Holland reduced RPMs significantly, bringing Topdalsfjord down to a crawl. On Cedarville, the situation was becoming critical. The radar contact was closing. The bearing was not changing appreciably. This is one of the clearest danger signs in navigation. Constant bearing, decreasing range. It means two vessels are on a collision course. The prudent response in restricted visibility is decisive action. Reduce speed, take way off, stop if necessary, and make a clear maneuver that the other vessel can understand. Small course changes at speed are dangerous. They create uncertainty, and in fog, uncertainty kills. According to helmsman Leonard Gabriciak, Cedarville was finally reduced to half speed, but the heavily loaded ship would not slow quickly. Captain Joppik ordered a turn to starboard. The distance continued to close. Then, through the fog, the white bow of Topdalsfjord appeared. It was almost directly perpendicular to Cedarville's port side. There was no time. Captain Joppik ordered full ahead and hard to port, attempting to swing the stern clear. It was too late. At 9:45 a.m., Topdalsfjord's reinforced bow slammed into Cedarville near hatch number 7, almost at a right angle. The impact drove deep into Cedarville's side. Topdalsfjord was already backing, but momentum carried her forward into the larger freighter. Then she pulled free. Water began pouring into Cedarville. The damage was catastrophic. The gash opened into the cargo hold, and water rushed into the limestone. From there, it filtered down into the hopper and conveyor tunnel beneath the holds. That tunnel ran along the ship and was not adequately compartmentalized to stop progressive flooding. Cedarville had been mortally wounded. The crew attempted to lower a collision mat over the damaged area, but the hole was too large. The mat was simply sucked into the opening. Captain Joppik radioed a mayday, giving his position near the Mackinac Bridge. Nearby vessels responded. Captain May aboard Weissenberg, who had watched the radar contacts merge, asked if Cedarville needed assistance. Joppik declined. He said they were holding out. But Cedarville was not holding out. Within minutes, she was settling lower in the water. The list to port increased. Engineers began pumping ballast to reduce the list. Counterflooding helped temporarily, but it also sacrificed reserve buoyancy. It treated the symptom, not the fatal injury. Many crewmen understood the ship was lost. They gathered aft near the life rafts, wearing life jackets and hard hats, waiting for the order to abandon ship. That order did not come. Instead, Captain Joppik decided to try to beach Cedarville. The anchor was raised, a course was selected. At about 10:15 a.m., Cedarville got underway again, attempting to reach shallow water. But the course chosen remains one of the most haunting parts of the disaster. There were closer shoal areas where Cedarville may have been grounded. Instead, she headed toward a point too far away. She made only about 2 miles. Weissenberg followed astern, her captain clearly aware that Cedarville might not survive the attempt. At 10:25 a.m., Cedarville's fight ended. Flooding overcame her. After counterflooding brought her briefly upright, she suddenly rolled hard to starboard. On the bridge, Leonard Gabrisiak had his life jacket on. Third mate Charles Cook struggled to fasten his. Captain Joppik moved to the bridge wing with a life jacket in hand and jumped. Gabrisiak looked back and saw Cook trying to climb the steepening deck as the ship rolled. Cook did not escape. Below, men were still in the engine room, trying to keep the ship alive. They had no warning, no abandoned ship order, no final chance. Cedarville rolled over and sank into the cold water of Lake Huron. Most of the crew standing aft were thrown into the lake. One lifeboat went down with the ship. Another managed to float free with survivors aboard. Life rafts surfaced as designed, but many men were suddenly in 36-degree water, surrounded by fog, wreckage, and the sounds of their ship disappearing beneath them. 8 men went down with Cedarville. Others fought to stay alive in the freezing water. Weissenberg was already close. Captain May had followed Cedarville because he understood what was likely coming. His crew heard men shouting in the fog. Lifeboats were lowered. Survivors were pulled from the water and brought aboard the German freighter. 6 men were rescued directly from the water. Others were found in Cedarville's lifeboat and life raft. But not all survived. Watchman Paul Jungmann became entangled as the ship sank and drowned before he could surface. Wheelsman Stanley Hask was pulled from the water barely alive, but died about an hour later. In total, 10 men were lost. Coast Guard boats arrived quickly, but by the time they reached the scene, Weissenberg had already saved everyone who could be saved. The Coast Guard cutter Mackinac later arrived and assumed command of the search. Divers later found several bodies inside the wreck, including men who had remained at their posts in the engine room. Some were never recovered. The investigation that followed was devastating for Captain Joppik. His testimony conflicted with vessel logs and survivor statements. Evidence showed that Cedarville had failed to reduce speed appropriately in restricted visibility, failed to maintain an effective radar plot, failed to properly assess the damage after the collision, and failed to order abandoned ship in time. Topdalsfjord was cleared of blame. Captain Holland had slowed in fog and acted in accordance with the navigation rules. Captain May and the crew of Weissenberg were praised for their actions. Their decision to remain close to Cedarville, launch boats, and recover survivors prevented the disaster from becoming even worse. The German vessel and her crew later received recognition for gallantry. The Cedarville disaster was not caused by one mistake. It was caused by many. A ship moving too fast in fog. A collision risk that was not acted on decisively. A failure to appreciate the severity of flooding. A delayed decision to beach. A course that led away from closer safety. And an abandoned ship order that never came. The SS Cedarville now rests upside down in the Straits of Mackinac, not far from the bridge she was trying to pass that morning. Her wreck remains a reminder that on the Great Lakes, danger does not always come from towering waves or winter storms. Sometimes it comes quietly. In fog. In uncertainty. In a radar contact that does not move. And in the few minutes when a captain still has time to make the decision that saves his crew. For 10 men aboard Cedarville, that decision came too late. If you want the next Maritime Debrief, drop the incident you want covered in the comments. Subscribe for weekly reconstructions of real casualties, real timelines, real lessons, and the mistakes we can still prevent. Fair winds and following seas.